Today we have Norman Turiano of Turiano Strategic Consulting presenting Sustainable Strategies and Succession. As a reminder, I mentioned earlier, but throughout the webinar, we are in listen-only mode, so if you have questions, feel free to use the question tool, and I will post those questions to Norman. We will post the webinar, record the webinar, and post it to our website at the conclusion, and then we will also send you an email with a link to the webinar and a PDF of the slide deck. So let's get started and introduce Norman. Norman has over 32 years of experience working with Wawa. In the later part of his career, he worked heading up the fuel business development area. He has expertise in retail fuel pricing, the customer experience, building a brand, alternative fuels, payments, and quite a few other areas of responsibility. After retiring from Wawa in 2012, he began a consulting career advising on issues of strategy, organization, operations, and transformation technology. He's currently engaged in the emerging Mexican market, resulting in the fuel deregulation there. In addition, in 2013, he accepted a board position with the Fuels Institute, a nonprofit research-oriented think tank, and he's dedicated to evaluating the market issues related to consumer vehicles and the fuels that power them. He holds a BA in Business Management from Stockton University of New Jersey and an MS in Marketing from St. Joseph's University of Philadelphia. Since retiring, which I'm incredibly jealous that he's got to retire at such a young age, he splits his time between Florida and New Jersey with his wife, 3 daughters, and 2 grandchildren. So, Norman, I want to welcome you, and I'll let you take over from here.
Sounds great, Allison. Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending this webinar. I want you to bear with me today because this will be the first webinar I've conducted. I generally speak before groups, but when you speak before a group, you can gauge the audience interest or disinterest, so this will be very interesting as I'm looking at nothing but my own screen. So, without further ado, I can let Allison know that the delay problem that you worried about and we didn't experience before has just suddenly taken place. There we go. So our first slide, why prepare? Why prepare for disruption? In every business, knowledge and speed matter to us, but knowledge and speed can be adversely affected by internal and external threats. In my case, the external threat could be our internet connection. Some things are seen and some things are unforeseen. I like to put them in 2 categories myself, hurricanes and tornadoes. Most external threats are like hurricanes. You know they're coming, you can watch their progress, you can note if the path changes, and you can plan it in advance for when it will strike. After it does strike, you can deal with the aftermath because you saw it coming and you had developed a successful plan in advance. Mostly, as I said, these are external threats, competing products coming onto the marketplace, regulatory changes which are announced in advance, new competitor entrants which take a while to ramp up and possibly harm you. And of course, obsolescence. One of the things we talk a lot about in the fuel industry is, will liquid fuels become obsolete or not? Now, the tornado effect are things that we don't expect. They're sudden and potentially more devastating because we couldn't plan for them. And they're usually internal to some degree, and of course, they affect us where it hurts, with our own teams. Recruiters can often come and try to take our best talent away, but we have ways of dealing with that potentially. But there could be illness, death, which is worse yet, or in my case, as Allison said, I suddenly decided to retire in 2012. It was more sudden for Wawa because I let them know of it at the end of the year, but I did decide somewhat at the beginning of the year to do so. And I spent a lot of my year preparing others for that transition. Now, not everybody might have that level of commitment to the organization, and that's why we need to prepare. The C-store industry sells 82% of the transportation fuel in the U.S., and we have to respond to volatile market changes quickly. It means the difference between maximizing our profits or completely missing budget goals, perhaps. And most of us in the industry have individuals or whole teams that intimately understand the markets that the sites are located in, giving them the ability to intuitively make pricing decisions that enable our organizations to produce sustainable gross profits. If we lose a staff member who holds the knowledge to operate any specific business function, and of course I'm going to speak to the fuel industry today, it will severely impact our business. Now, the key to minimizing such a disruption is to ensure there's a smooth transition in the event we do lose a key staff member. You see, hopefully we have a picture of Pope Francis there, Allison?
We do. Yes, we do. You're fine.
Okay. That was just a check because it wasn't moving forward before. Thank you. So he's generally beloved, and he's creating quite a stir in the Catholic world because a lot of people have no idea what he's doing in relationship to what his predecessors done. The article in last month's Geographic summed it up very nicely. People are wondering if he's going to change or if he's going to change the church. Largely, this is because he can pretty much do anything he wants because, as he's quoted here, there's no guidelines for him to follow. I believe those of you who are listening today are here because you clearly understand the business impact of not having a succession plan in place. My goal today is to help you all walk away with the tools to create sustainable strategies to survive such a disruption. So today we're going to discuss building and documenting strategies, ensuring that we have the right people in the right positions and with the right tools, creating relational strategies within organizations, and the benefit of adopting technologies to support your teams. We're going to start by discussing the building and documenting of strategies. Unlike Pope Francis, we want to ensure there's a clear path for someone new to a position, especially if it's one of our fueling departments, to follow while they're building up their own expertise in that area. Clearly, it's the role of the business owner, or if it's a larger organization, the CEO and the executive management team to conduct a needs assessment for the organization. This assessment needs to take into account the strategic plan, the goals and objectives that support the brand image for the organization, as well as any specific programs or projects that will greatly impact the organization somewhat into the future. After this has taken place, it's then the role of someone else, which in a larger organization would be the HR department, to match the needs of the organization as relayed to them by the management team to the talents of the existing employees, creating strategies to manage the gaps that are uncovered, to execute the strategies, and then on an ongoing basis monitor results as well as update the process, because as we know, our needs today may not be the same needs we have next week. One of the first steps is to ensure that job descriptions are very clear, specific, and measurable. So when we use phrases, rather than say in a job description, a role is to contribute to corporate profitability, it's better to say meet or exceed annual GP budget, because those are numbers that are stated clearly and they're very measurable every year. Another example is, work well with others or work collaboratively with others. Make sure that that collaboration is integrated and those plans are integrated into the achievement of the goals and strategies, and again, that they're laid out and measurable. Finally, I put on there, identify, explore, and define new revenue streams. That was one in my last role at Wawa, and some of the things that we had performed at Wawa in my later years were developing corporately a fleet card program, again, measurable, as well as other projects.
Norman, this is Allison. We do have a question from someone, and it was regarding actually the retail fuel market, and wanted to know some suggestions on, because it's a new person, suggestions on measurable goals for their next year, for 2016. Like, what were some of the things that you measured at Wawa? You mentioned the fleet card. Were there other things specific to fuel?
So in the area of fuel, clearly there were measurable items such as margins, gallons, and profitability. My experience and does not reflect the views of Wawa Incorporated, so I'm not going to speak for anybody that is there today, but my focus generally was on gallons and the GP budget. And to me, the GP budget was an output of gallons because, as we all know, margins fluctuate. One of the interesting things I learned at Wawa was that you could pretty much expect the cost of a hoagie to remain constant or near constant over time, and prices in relationship to that would give you expected margins. But unfortunately, as anyone in the audience knows, fuel doesn't work in that way. You can have many months with no margins, some with negative margins, and some with beautiful margins. So at the end of the day, the goal was to keep an eye on things that were within our control. And I believed personally those things were gallons and the GP that resulted from it.
Okay, great, thank you.
So on the screen, you have a process map. Because the next step in what we were just discussing that's very critical and most often ignored is to map out tasks and processes that support the achievement of the job responsibilities we just discussed. This slide shows the process for conducting what would be a tour of sites for a company that I've worked with in the United States in order to assess the accuracy of the competitors they're looking at and the pricing strategies they're using. Now, to a large degree, many in the audience may say, well, that looks silly. Why would you lay that out? That is so simple. But remember, to all of us, everything is easy if we've done it before. If you've never done it before and you suddenly become responsible for it, a simple process map such as this can become invaluable. So you're going to ask your associates to perform something like put together those process maps, and you can expect a lot of grumbling about it. I personally was one of them. It'll take time. Sometimes people fear that you're looking to replace them and asking them to spell out exactly what their job is for the replacement. And my personal grumble all the time was, I could be making money. I could be selling gas. I could be doing something more beneficial than this. But in the end, I understood the importance of doing so. And that is the most important thing that we must do, is communicate the value of this process. In the event, they themselves may be promoted. So for example, if I was going to be promoted suddenly into a role somewhere else in the organization, I would have loved to have process maps available for myself to help me understand the new job that I was going to do. I didn't want anything less for the people who might replace me, so that they would understand what it was I did, why I did it, and how I did it. It also, the value that we want to communicate to the team members is it frees them up to take time for themselves and grow. The user manual process is a three-step process. The associate who does the job creates the document which shows what the process is. There's a maintenance aspect in that there needs to be annual reviews and updates, and it doesn't need to be annual, but I would offer that if you do it less than annually, you'll be surprised at how much changed. And it needs to be accessible. It can't be put together, put in a piece of paper, stapled into a bigger binder, and put somewhere so that, God forbid, somebody has to leave the company, gets promoted, takes a maternity leave or a family leave from the organization. Where's the binder at? So for a large number of companies that have it, I recommend keep it on the company drive where everything else is kept. Now, you'll notice that previously I showed you a flow chart in my example. I highly recommend this because flowcharting is much easier to follow than 200 words on a page. I personally get lost after the first 2 sentences of any paragraph. So a flowchart is a simple visual way of explaining what you do. There's a number of appropriate tools out there you could use. Many people that I work with and some of my clients generally use the top 3, which are Visio, SmartDraw, and Flowcharter, and some use eDraw, in that order actually.
Norman, at this time, I'd like to take a quick poll because you just talked about the documentation. For those attendees, do you mind checking on the poll? It says, how are you documenting your fuel pricing strategies at this time? So Norman just showed us that he had used Visio. Someone might use another tool. I'm curious for those that are on the line right now, some of you, are you not documenting at all? I'm documenting some, but it still remains with one person, possibly on their desktop or is in a spreadsheet on their desk, or completely, and you share among the team so you have some redundancy among your team. And it looks like we kind of have a split. From those that are answering, we say it's generally right now a little less than half are not documenting at all, and then we have about 30% are some and 30% are completely. So thank you very much for that, and Norman, I'll let you head on.
Not a problem. So at this point, I'd like to discuss the most critical component for success for any organization in my mind, which is people. And as you can see from this illustration, it's very telling. People working together is the most critical thing. Give me 1 second. There we go. The most critical step is loading the bench. And you must ensure that you've loaded the bench with a number of players that aren't only skilled at what they do, but are able to step into other roles when necessary. This flowchart, to me, shows a simple 4-step process to do so. The first is internal analysis. The leadership team needs to develop a solid understanding of the most significant challenges the company is likely to face in the near future, and the skills and experiences the person would need to get past those hurdles. Secondly, there's a development of potential candidates. If they're internal candidates, it begins with the identification of a small number of people who could be made ready within a year and developing mentoring programs and development programs for them. As the transition approaches, the internal candidates should be ready. If the development of internal talent has been successful, clear candidates will arise. If none emerges, then it's time to start looking outside of the organization, possibly for external candidates. Of course, the final step, implementation, that's the trigger that you never know when you'll need to pull. But if the 3 steps up front have been taken care of adequately, you're ready to do so. As there's considerable ramp up for an external candidate, as we just discussed, it's definitely more cost effective to invest in our current associates. Such an investment will keep the aforementioned recruiters at bay. Don't want them trying to take our associates away. And I want to point out that studies show that happy, motivated, involved associates in a company are less likely to leave an organization even if they're offered more pay. So this is important for us to take into account when we consider continuing to raise payrolls to keep talent with us. A lot of times the reason people leave is they weren't engaged, they didn't feel part of the organization. So the first step here is identification. We need to identify what tasks can be successfully performed by others and identify people who have those competencies to perform those tasks. In my former life at Wawa, our administrative assistant and our information manager had similar skill sets, so we were able to have them train each other to do each other's jobs when necessary, and oftentimes they covered each other's vacations successfully. But cross-trained associates don't necessarily need to work within the same department, as I just showed in that example. They may be people from outside of the department. I know of a case where a CPA who worked in finance was cross-trained to perform daily hedging activities in the fuel department. This enabled the individual to eventually take advantage of an opening that presented itself up the road. Your project management departments, if your organizations are large enough, are a great resource for finding incredible talent. At Wawa, after I had left, we apparently promoted somebody from that department to Director of Retail Fuels. The skill sets that somebody in a project management position often transition well to other roles within any organization because they have a keen sense of process and process-driven decision making. So, incorporation. Cross-training and mentoring isn't going to happen by accident no matter how much we wish it. To be successful, we have to incorporate it into each employee's development plan and then make it part of the evaluation process. This way that they are accountable for the results. Finally, recognition is very important regarding associates and employees that gain these new skills. That recognition can take place publicly, for example, in departmental meetings, in organizational meetings. It's a pat on the back that everyone enjoys. It also takes place in the annual appraisal process if you've placed it within their developmental plans and evaluations. And finally, if you're an organization whose appraisals are tied to bonuses, they're definitely compensated there.
Norman, we have a question again. This is an interesting one, and I think if you start out in the beginning and then the question is, how large was the fuel department and your team at Wawa as far as FTEs? And when I say start at the beginning, because in the beginning isn't the same as when you left Wawa. You had quite a history there.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm going to speak more to this later when we talk about technology, but I can speak about it now also, that the fuel department started out, so keep in mind I was on the retail side of the business. There were two parts, supply and transportation and retail pricing and brand. So on our side, there were originally 4 full-time associates, which quickly became 8 as we began ramping up. As many people know, we started with 0 fuel stores and rapidly increased that number. As we were growing, we saw that the number would just exponentially increase unless we changed the way we viewed things. So every year, and it came to be known as the September change, we often would restructure the organization to meet the needs of the coming year, and by organization I mean department. We would change the department roles and responsibilities to meet the coming challenges and the differing number of stores. And we were able to maintain headcount from that initial 8 in the early years to when I left, I believe there were only 11 of us still. And we were able to do that by increasing responsibility and scope, by reducing administrative tasks and non-value-added tasks, by increasing our reliance on technology to enable us to handle more and more high-level items. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does that make sense to our attendee? I guess I'll find out shortly. Thank you. Oh, he says yes. He or she. I'm sorry.
Excellent. So here I've listed characteristics of high performers. To many of us, this is no surprise. Does a high performer or somebody promotable or someone that we want to fast track need to have every one of these? Not necessarily. The more they have, the more promotable they are. Most research shows that if someone has just 3 profound strengths, they're in very good shape. Naturally, I feel strongly about a few of these. High ethics means a lot to me. It means having high moral character, someone who upholds the values of the organization. Their high ethical standards continue to be something that everyone can count on. When they say something in a leadership role, people can count on them that that is exactly what they mean. Next on my list would be strategic, clearly strategic. There's no accident why my company is called Relational Strategic Consulting. It stands out by an arm's length in most studies. It differentiates most executives who ultimately rise to senior positions because, and I'll use an example of skiing. When my wife and I would ski, even though she skied 20 years before I did, and I was a newcomer, she would often follow me, and I once asked her why. She said, because I always look about 5 to 10 feet in front of me, and I go slower as a result. You're always looking about a half mile ahead and plotting out every move you're going to make well before it happens, so I feel comfortable following you. It's a key thought to keep in mind when we discuss the importance of strategies versus tactics. And finally, number 3 I have on here, and I ordered them in my favorites, of course, embracing change. Promotable leaders and charismatic leaders have the courage to make changes, improving the organization because they embrace change. They know it's coming, they love it, they embrace it. It's like riding a wave at the beach.
Norman, this would be a good time to ask our next poll for those attendees. Do you identify and develop talent for key positions? So this, and when we ask for key positions, this might be a store manager, it might be the fuel pricing manager, it might be managers throughout departments. So with those of you that are participating here, if you don't mind giving us an answer to that, because it also helps us guide us in the content for the webinar. So we have the questions, nope, not that I know of, only for C-level, and yes for all key positions. And right now, this is really great feedback. It says that right now, 100% of those who are voting said they do have a plan to develop talent for key positions. So that's fantastic. That's good to know. Thank you.
Very interesting information. I'm looking forward to see the results of the polls after we're done. So let's talk about relational strategies. And I love this graphic because it's really, as I just spoke about with skiing, it's looking down the road, looking far down the road to what lies ahead. And I believe most of the people who are on this webinar are here because they clearly understand the business impact of sustainability and succession plans. So my goal here is to help you walk away with tools to create a sustainable strategy to survive business disruption, which may or may not occur in your organization. So what does relational strategies mean? It's an agreement between 2 or more parties to conduct specified activities or processes to achieve specified objectives such as project implementation, et cetera, et cetera. And let's boil it down. It really means it's a group of people working on something specific with a measurable outcome, and it's generally in terms of project implementation, et cetera. And sometimes it's product development. In my experience, it was more on project implementation. I'll talk more about that in a minute. This approach is important. It relies on decentralizing the decision making. The decision isn't being made at the top. The decision authority has been pushed down to those who intimately know the situation. It's no secret at this point, so I can discuss the fact that Wawa did not have diesel at one point, and at another point decided to go into the diesel business. So the question became, where do we put diesel? How do we put diesel? When do we put diesel? I was very proud to work for such an organization that understood to decentralize such decision-making. So a team was created, and of course, since I was in the fuel department, it naturally fell on my shoulders to lead that department. Why? Because I was responsible for the outcome. I said lead the department. What I meant was lead the team. We developed a cross-functional team, which I'll talk more about, which was able to make decisions because everyone in the room understood various aspects of the decision and what needed to be placed into the decision-making process. It's a very participatory style of making decisions. Everyone at the table has input, it's valued, it's needed to make everything work. It capitalizes on informal communication networks. Most of the people at the table for this particular project did not communicate directly with each other on a normal basis, and a lot of us just informally got together and spoke about things on the side, often had lunch together, so there was communication there. Traditionally, we have a silo approach. The silo approach, if you don't have cross-functional teams, we're all familiar with this. It's very myopic. It's my department. It's my responsibility. I'm only concerned about what I need to be concerned about. That's someone else's problem. As a result, it's very inefficient, very protectionist. Yeah, you're worried about protecting your flank and no one else. As a result, the last thing I have there is it reduces morale. It's not empowering. It's not invigorating. If you're someone who embraces change and wants to have an impact on your organization, the silo approach does not work. The illustration, I think, sums it up pretty well. Personally, I prefer the cross-functional approach, and while I led many cross-functional teams, not one of them looked like this, except in skill levels. And I chose this illustration because the A team, for any of you who are old enough to remember, and I'm one of them, was a team of people with different personalities and different skill sets that worked together and always managed to get the job done. They represent the whole organization. A great cross-functional team brings all sorts of skills to the table. As I talked about with Diesel, at the table we had people from real estate, we had people from construction, we had people from finance, we had people from marketing, we had, of course, myself from the fuel department, as well as a couple of other people from fuel. And as you see, we all came with a diversity of knowledge about various aspects. For example, I might want to put Diesel in this store because it's a great store to have it. Unfortunately, real estate knew that maybe it wasn't in our original, what's the word I'm looking for, deed. The deed restricted us from ever putting Diesel there. Okay, maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe the construction guy knew when we built the store, it was on bedrock, and we blasted a hole in the bedrock to put the tanks in the first place. That was great when we built the store. It's not very safe to blow a hole into the ground next to existing tanks to add another one if you want diesel. As a result of all of this diversity at the table, it's a very, very creative group because everyone saw things from a different perspective. We all felt empowered because we were given a task. We're going to build X amount of sites. We want to have this. Is it doable, and how will we do it? Everyone at that table, no matter what level in the organization, felt empowered. And as a result, we were naturally cross-trained. The same people who sat at this one team also sat on two other teams with me with completely different focuses, which impacted the fuel department. However, everyone became so cross-trained in the other views and the other aspects and what was important that it became a natural team in and of itself. Now, sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Everything is great, beautiful. We all sang, held hands, kumbaya? No, not really. In any cross-functional team, you're going to have unique challenges. What are those unique challenges? The fact that the people who came to the cross-functional team came with the silo mentality from their other department with them in some cases. There will be rivalries, sometimes egos. Some people were just happy to be part of the team. Some people wanted to sit closer to the leader. Decision-making, definitely slower. When you have consensus and not somebody saying this is how we will do it, it's going to take a while to make the decisions. Sometimes there were differing agendas. I personally may have wanted to follow one path, and maybe for reasons completely unrelated to why I wanted that path, someone had a different agenda. And then there's subterfuge. What do I mean by subterfuge? Well, maybe that person with that agenda never publicly showed they had agenda. They quietly may have thrown rocks in the path. And I love this cartoon because it really shows an example of subterfuge. We can't show these numbers to the VP. We'll look bad. We'll find something we're doing well and give it to him instead. And wow, our internal subterfuge is up 80%. And I love that example because I have a great example of it in my real life. At one point, we had a team looking at, as many of you know, Wawa went into the Florida market, and there was a big question as to what should those sites look like. Will they be the same or different? And what decisions should we make? And we were making a decision about a piece of equipment, and we set out by doing all the right things. We put together a decision matrix as to what was important. We all weighted it as to what was more important than everything else. Everyone did hold hands and sang Kumbaya. We went through the entire process, and 2 months later, we came to a decision using the process. We then made a decision at the table, which was contrary to what the model and everything told us. Unfortunately, the problem was nobody wanted to go tell people that we were making a decision that was going to be more costly than the other decision. Suddenly, in everyone's mind, cost became more important than the correct decision. So this is why team leadership is critical. In my role as the team leader, I had to refocus the team back on, okay, I'm fine with this decision, but let's go back and make sure. We said this was important, and this was important, and this is important. Then why are we saying something contrary to what all the facts and data are saying? And at the end of the day, and I say at the end of the day, it was the end of a couple of weeks, one-day meetings, we all realized at the table that we were just afraid to say we were going to spend more money. But luckily somebody, and again from the project management office who sat on our team, pointed out that many times we had, as an organization, bought a piece of equipment which was much more expensive. Maybe we had fuel cords that had a different look to them than something out of the box. And we decided as an organization to make those investments for a reason. So again, the diversity that comes to the table is critical, and that PMO person was able to give us an illustration, and everyone at the table felt good that you're right, this isn't bad, we are making a good decision. So in looking for a leader, and I'm not going to tell you all the aspects a leader should have, because I think we discussed that before, but this is why it's critical. And rank is immaterial. Oftentimes there were people at the table who had higher rank per se than I in the organization. But I owned the finished product for the fuel department, so that is why I was the leader. And that's the first thing. If the person who's leading the team is not responsible for the outcome and the results, we have a problem. They have to be respected. Nobody wants to be at you'll never come to decisions if the team leader is not respected. The team leader needs to understand there are egos and various needs in the room. And by needs, I'll say sometimes I had to work with people who had bosses that were pushing them in a different direction. And I had to help them manage those issues because they didn't want to be the ones to have to go back and tell their boss that they weren't supporting their boss's agenda. So oftentimes I had to meet with their boss and convince their boss that this was the right idea so that the team member didn't get run over by the bus in the process. Other roles, providing the resources to get the job done, ensuring that there's a focus on facts and data, which are resources, but ensuring that we stuck to them. Removing obstacles, the example I just gave about someone's boss is a good obstacle. There's other obstacles. We can't find the equipment, we don't have the resources, etc. Finally, the appropriate team leader understands that you're not there as a leader to make the decision. You're not there to tell the group to rubber stamp what you think is the right answer. You have to let the team develop the solution. And this is why if you have team leaders who fall into that role in successive projects, they're successful because they're respected. Everyone knows that they're there not pushing their own agenda, but that of the group. Allison?
Norman, yeah, I do. I've got another poll. Let's check and see of those attending, how many of you work with other category managers on relational strategies? So Norman just talked a lot about like cross-functional teams with projects, but this question is more specific, I think, with relational strategies maybe on products, on promotions, on it could be quite anything really, but it's those cross-relational strategies in different departments. So we're checking to see how many, and we've got, it looks like occasionally, some occasionally, and some always. And the majority is occasionally. Thankfully, we don't have any nevers right now. That's good to know. So I think everyone's on the right track. So I appreciate you answering that. I'll close that poll, and then we can move on. Thank you.
Sounds great. So our final section, discussing the value that technology can add to an organization's profitability as well as their sustainability. And sustainability is a funny word. While I was employed with Wawa, sustainable was something that was always glued in my head to gross profit because a large portion of my responsibility was producing gross profit. But in this discussion, we're talking about the sustainability also of a department and of an organization. So, how can technology help us? There's an art and a science to everything. Art is always people. People are artists. They have visions. They have creativity. They have passion. And like this illustration, you got this cute baby. You don't know what they're going to do. And oftentimes they create these, this could be considered a mess behind the baby. It could be considered a beautiful work of art. Now, science is a process and often includes technology in it. It's efficient, it works quickly, and it increases scope. And of course, here I use a photo of Commander Data for any of you who watched Star Trek back in the day. And I love this picture because look at the puzzled look on his face. I can almost imagine him trying to understand some human quality here in behavior. For me, perhaps it was I'm setting prices for a certain store and my competitor across the street always stayed 2 cents behind me, and suddenly they're 10 cents behind me, or maybe they're 10 cents above me. And I'm looking at them trying to understand. And if I'm just completely scientific and process-driven, I may have that puzzled look on my face, and I might have it for a long time. Art. Art is, let's talk about art versus science. Art's very creative. The pros are you understand competitor behavior. So in the early days of Fuel, I had no technology to help me, so I had to intimately know my competitors, know what was driving them. Maybe they were having financial problems, maybe they were putting kids through college, maybe there were things driving them to do things. What was motivating them? I had that personal knowledge. When I would come up with pricing strategies, I could sit at my desk. And as a matter of fact, when I left 3 years ago, I could sit at my desk and visualize the 300 fuel stores that existed that time. And I could see their parking lots. I could see their competitors. I had a very creative way of understanding what was going on. Unfortunately, to continue in that manner, we would have had to keep increasing headcount because the human mind can only handle so much more information. The system's human. I often used to say, how much water can you put into a pitcher? And somebody would say, well, how big's the pitcher? 1 gallon? And they'd say 1 gallon. I'd say, no, I could pour gallons and gallons and gallons of water into that pitcher, but every time I'm adding water, other water is spilling out. And that's what the human mind does. And depending on if you're sick or if you step out of the role and someone else steps into it, what do you have? Inconsistent execution. Now, science Science is beautiful. It's much more precise. It's consistent. It never gets sick. It's always well. 1 and 1 always equals 2. And you don't have to worry about headcount. The machine can keep handling more and more data. What's the con? So let's talk about computers and chess. For many years, computers could not beat a chess player. Eventually they did. Why? Because eventually they learned to win because there's a finite number of physical moves. And over time, we were able to program computers to understand every single one of those moves. You can't do that in the real world when you're dealing with humans because there are numerous permutations of moves that can occur. There are things that deal with emotion that do not make any sense. The people who may be setting prices, for example, out in a competitive set may have, you assume they're changing their price because of you, but maybe they're changing their price because of somebody else, or maybe because they're short on cash, or maybe because their wife wants a necklace, or their husband wants a new car. It's too difficult to process. You can't process the emotional factor that comes into that. But you can optimize artists by giving them science. It adds value. You can maintain or reduce headcount. And as I explained before, at Wawa, we were able to continue building scientific models and systems and pricing models that enabled us to handle much more data every day by reducing the more administrative parts and enabling us to focus on more and more sites. I'll give you an example. An artist, if an artist was painting a picture to sell, and he had to finish that picture, and he had to sell it, and then he had to go out and buy more paint, and he had to buy more canvases, and he had to set it up and think about what to paint next, he would not produce many pictures. However, by using, perhaps paint would be ordered directly via Amazon, and canvases would show up, and orders would come in over the internet, he could more efficiently produce much more painting and therefore gain much more revenue. So technology can always enhance people, but you couldn't have the computer, in my mind, paint the picture. In my mind, sometimes people, and I've worked with some, and I know others, they believe that we can reduce headcount by eliminating people with technology. I'm a firm believer that will never happen. People add too much to the equation to ever be eliminated. However, the role of technology is to enable them to do much, much more. They can increase their scope. You can reduce costs as an organization. For example, when we talk about pricing, if I wanted to change a price at a site now, I would make X amount of dollars. If I called the store and asked the manager to change the price and they forgot, or if they got busy, or if something happened and pulled them away, maybe that execution wouldn't take place right away. That would cost money. There could be human error. If we're going to talk about pricing, let me focus on that for a while. If I called the store and said, let's raise the price to $220.9, and they heard $229, that could vastly affect the business. I might have nice margins on what little gallons I might have. There's training time and costs. Every time we have to train people on administrative tasks that aren't value added, it adds to the training time and the cost of doing so. Now, the other way technology clearly enhances people is it increases our sustainability. It's much more process driven. We developed a pricing model in my former career that enabled us to handle much more sites, set much more prices, have much more data in order to execute that. And with everything documented with process maps and job responsibilities that were clearly written, if I were to leave, I was comfortable that the process would continue sustainably into the future. And as I said before, it was somewhat surprising at the age of 52 to state that I was willing and ready to retire. But Wawa, I'd love to say they probably missed me. They couldn't function without me, but I'm prouder to say they didn't even miss a beat. All the processes were in place. Norman added something to the table, but Norman was someone who had a role and responsibility that was clearly stated. Process maps showed everything he did, and there were technologies and pricing systems, etc., in place. There was mentoring and coaching that was going on that they were able to absorb the shock, if there was a shock of me leaving.
Hey, Norman, there was
Yes.
a quick question that was posted, and it's really interesting. They said, if I were to create a business case to use fuel pricing software, would you recommend it be based on the ROI from improved employee efficiency or ROI from improved volumes and margins? I think that's an interesting question.
ROI on efficiency or margins? Okay. So
yeah, they wanted to create a business case.
Absolutely. I would state that in the business case, it would be needed to be looked at from both standpoints, because there is a benefit, one would assume, from putting technology in place that would enable you to, and since we're going to talk about pricing software here, you could perhaps make better pricing decisions and make more gross profit. There's the benefit of reduced headcount, which increases more net profit. There's the cost of training, which is larger if you don't have such systems in place, which you would also need to look at that. So there's a risk-benefit analysis that would have to take place, looking at the benefit of both of those items, but also the risks of not taking those items into account. For example, one of the reasons I used pricing software in my former role was the fact that we had data that showed how often price changes were not done in a timely basis. So by looking at that number and extrapolating out what it costs, we understood that by improving any technological solution, we reduced that cost. Does that make sense?
It sure does. Great. Okay. And yes, the person said yes, that answers their question. Thank you.
So here, since you're hosting me, Allison, I am using Price Advantage software, which I am fond of. I will not talk about anything we used at Wawa, but I will assure you that in using pricing software, here's the key things you have to look at. What are the prices that are proposed based on prices that are out there? How do you get those prices into there? What does the model say that the best price you could sell at for the most profit would be? And then making a recommendation on that price. I know people very well who would say we can completely automate this and we don't need people at all. Unfortunately, I will offer an example of why that can't ever take place. You could put the best guidelines into a pricing system and walk away with a disaster. If your brand image is to be very fair to your consumers and not take advantage of them, and perhaps you have a hurricane that drives costs sky high, personally, you may understand that that sky-high spike in costs is short-term, and perhaps you should just ignore it and lose some money if necessary. If you have software where you've set the guidelines to just follow people blindly, and you're only looking at one or two people, and let's say they jump their price up $5 a gallon, you're going to go up $5 a gallon with them and suffer the brand devastation that will result from having your organization dragged through the newspapers as price gouging. And I think everyone in this room understands that the general public does not see the retail fuel industry as benevolent. They think we will have Swiss chalets. They think we make tons of money. They think that we're just taking advantage of them, and they use the word gouging frequently. We all know the difference. So this is why I'm a firm proponent of suggested prices. There are instances where you can automate things, but never underestimate the need for a human being to intervene in a process to ensure that something doesn't go wrong or that your brand promise is not violated. This is another example of pricing software which is being used to suggest prices purely on economics. Again, the best software you can use will not just use economics. It will use specific guidelines and curbs that will ensure that whatever your promise is of your brand to your customers is, that it'll be met. I liken it to taking one of my grandchildren bowling. At 3 years old, I can help them with the bowling ball, and I can make sure that that bowling ball always lands at the end of the alley, because we'll use bumpers in the alleys to make sure it doesn't go into the alley. Bumpers are nothing more than ensuring that you have maximum and minimum prices in order to set your prices. At this point, Allison, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Absolutely. I've got a couple in queue here that someone submitted, and someone piggybacked off the last question because they talked about the business case. And this question was, this is regarding purchasing or using fuel pricing software. And the question is, do you think the cost of fuel pricing software produces enough ROI to justify it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have yet to work with an organization anywhere in the U.S., and I do have Mexican clients where the market is being deregulated, and they're pondering using software themselves. I've yet to meet any organization that would not benefit from pricing software.
Cool. Here's the question that was actually posted a while earlier in the presentation, and I did not see it. It's interesting because this person states, I have a person in mind from a different team that I'd like to move over to they want to poach apparently from a different department. Says, I would like to have on my fuel pricing team this may cause disruption and a feud because it's a small company if I steal from another department. Do you have recommendations?
Absolutely. I was in that position myself where we had a individual who worked in another segment of the business, completely different, the wholesale side. And as we went into a fleet commercial program, we felt he would be an asset to selling the fleet cards. So I personally met with his boss and discussed it with him. And I was able to do so because Wawa is an organization that has high ethics. And one of the ethics that it holds is value people and treat them right. So at Wawa, we never held people back from success because we understood that as an organism, we would be, or as an organization, I should say, which is an organism, we would be successful if we all succeeded. So his boss and I were able to discuss whether or not he would be appropriate for the position, which he felt he strongly would. He was happy that I was able to offer him this opportunity, and I worked with him in having a timeline for him to replace him. By working with him, I was able to get the employee I wanted for the position, and he was able to replace that employee with somebody who was more motivated because this person had been in a role for 2 years and saw no way out from where he was at.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think that's interesting because I think that's common in a great management technique is that as managers and leaders, you're there to make sure your employees have potential and have a growth path, and if it isn't on their department or even within the company, to help them even grow and even leave the company if there's no growth path internally. And that's what makes employees happy. If they feel that they're boxed in, then I think there's a higher rate of attrition because they have no choice but to leave as opposed to move internally.
Absolutely, Allison, and that's the concern I always have with the silo mentality. It only protects the silo, and it leaves no career paths for anyone in it, and that's why it's so inefficient and so demotivating. Clearly, when the whole organization from the top down embraces cross-functionality, mentoring, and development, there's opportunity for everyone, and the organization thrives as a result.
Here's another great question. It was just posted. They're coming in quickly now. How do you best work with a pricing manager who is not receptive to change and puts i.e. use of technology? And I swear that's not a loaded question. I did not write that question. It's from a participant.
So it's funny. I was at NACS a few weeks back, and I was speaking with an organization somewhere in the U.S., which will go nameless, where they have one person responsible for pricing, and he's very hesitant to embrace the technology. And it's for that very reason. He's afraid that he will be replaced by the technology. At the same time, he's very upset that there's a new competitor in his market that's beating the pants off of him, and he can't understand how they're doing what they're doing or why they're doing what they're doing. And in a short discussion, his complete hatred of technology was somewhat alleviated when I started explaining to him the benefits of using that technology, that clearly he was frustrated now, he didn't feel like he was winning, he felt like his job was endangered, and that the technology could provide him a tool to provide sustainable gross profit to his organization and thereby have job security.
Mm-hmm. You know, that's interesting. This is not an uncommon fear among people that we talk to when we're talking about implementing price advantage, because the fear is that the technology will replace them. You know, that old saying that knowledge is power. This person still holds the knowledge. They're just using the tool to implement it faster and better. And I spoke to one person at NACS as well, and I said, do you ever get to take a vacation? And he said, no. He says, I'm pricing fuel Saturday and Sunday mornings, and when I'm on vacation, I have to, you know, call in and check. And I said, well, wouldn't it be nice for at least 1 week to be able to actually take a vacation, or to not have to call in on a Saturday? And really only using the technology allows you to manage by exception. So, you know, if he sets his strategies up properly and he's on vacation, he can have someone else step in and only make decisions based on when the strategies, pricing is falling outside those strategies that he established. So that's what we talk about, managed by exception. So rather than having to price 25 or 75 stores, he might only have to look at 3 because they're outside of his rules.
And that's funny you should mention that, Allison. That's a very important point I want to build on. When I was at Wawa and we started in the fuel department, it was generally expected, not by the company, but by ourselves, that we would work 7 days a week because nobody else could price the stores. That only we knew how to price the stores because they were our stores. If there were 3 of us and we each had a third of the company, we knew best what was best for the company. If we didn't implement pricing software, we would have never, ever, ever had a day off. Because we used pricing software, we were able to take weekends off and have one person on call every weekend who could handle the entire company. It's not something that they could do on an ongoing basis, because someone asked me that once. Well, if they could do it for 2 days, why can't they do it forever? Because, again, there's intimate knowledge at stake. It's kind of like my 15-year-old daughter. I'll bet you if I had a heart attack, she could drive the car to the hospital. But I wouldn't have her drive me cross-country or taxi me around, as a rule.
Right. Right. Okay. Denise asked that question. Are you good, Denise? Any other clarification? While we're waiting for her to respond, there is one more, and this is interesting because this person asked, did you ever work where 2 categories should be working together but are not? And how do you motivate them and their supervisors or leadership to join forces?
You know what? I almost wonder if there's somebody from Wawa out there, because it's one of the things that I saw as a benefit and a curse at times. As many people know, Wawa was not in the fuel business initially. We went into it in 1996. It was a different category, and as such, it was treated differently. And I always struggled with the fact that we had a marketing department managing every category in the company except for one, being fuel. And it created a natural tension, but we were able to deal with that by teamwork and ensuring that we were always at the same tables, and again, cross-functionality. There was always somebody from the marketing department representing them at fuel meetings. And the marketing department made sure that fuel was represented when we developed budgets and for the coming year for advertising or anything that affected fuel. So yes, I have personal knowledge of how that could work. I've never resolved in my mind whether if it was truly a benefit or a curse. And to this day, as I'm no longer there, I don't know. I'd have to call one of my friends over there and ask.
That's great. Well, there are a few more questions that I'm going to have to answer offline because I do want to respect the fact that we have gone over our hour. Norman, if you do want to push to the last slide, simply so that it gets recorded and the folks that are attending can see it. Norman, again, is an independent strategic consultant that specializes not in just the fuel area, but also in processes and strategies and so forth. His contact information is on here. Feel free to contact him directly. My email address is on here as well as the office phone number. Feel free to call me at any time if you have any questions regarding this webinar or if you just have questions in general. So at this time, I want to thank all of our attendees, remind you that this webinar has been recorded. I will send it link to you upon when we get it posted to our website. So I want to thank you for all your time. And Norman, thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate it as part of our thought sharing webinar series.
You're welcome, Allison. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.